We'll be looking at the lessons that today's politicians and political elites can learn from one of English literature's most important works, Beowulf. We'll be visiting some of the histories of the greatest leaders, from Julius Caesar to Cesare Borgia to Napoleon Bonaparte. What did they have in common? Why did they achieve what others couldn't? And what hope or dismay can this give us in today's electoral forces? All this and more on today's edition of The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose. I'm Mark Angelides for LibertyNation.com. Politics and power are far removed from what they used to be. Where once it was bravery and boldness that won the day, where decisive action spurred the victory, now, it seems, the only question ever asked is, will it be popular enough to keep me in power? We see politicians flip-flop so often, they're like a gasping fish on the riverbank. A firm position they once held is now anathema to them. Look no further than the idea of building a border wall between the United States and Mexico. Today you can tune in and hear Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, all talking down the idea of a wall as racist and immoral. But the video footage is out there. Just a few years ago, they were all demanding a wall. Did circumstances change so much? Or is it that these people are mere creatures of opportunity, willing to cast aside a sincerely held belief for the shot of a couple more years of power? As Groucho Marx once said, "Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others." But it is rarely the fluttering butterfly of popular opinion, landing on one flower and then the next, that shapes our view of history. It is the actions of the bold that we remember, and that we compare others to. I want to talk briefly about a few of the boldest actions ever taken. These events are historical record. They really happened. Yet they rival the greatest feats of grandeur that any Hollywood producer could imagine. And here's the thing. None of these daring deeds were popular. They were committed, rightly or wrongly, because of real belief. Belief in yourself and your principles is a huge idea, and it's one that seems to have been sacrificed in the modern era on the altar of opinion polling. And we, the teeming powerless masses, are far poorer for it. The first example of self-belief I want to share comes from Gaius Julius Caesar, but not when he was a great military commander and de facto leader of Rome, but from when he was just 25 years old and alone, without the might or the power of the Roman Empire behind him. Caesar was serving on a fleet ship when it was captured by pirates. The officers were told that they would be ransomed, and if the money didn't come, then they would be killed. When the leader of the pirates said that he would ransom Caesar for 20 talents of silver, this is over $500,000 in today's money, Caesar laughed in his face and said that for someone as important as himself, he should ask for at least 50 talents. But Caesar warned that they would never get a chance to spend it, as he would hunt them down and have them all crucified. Can you imagine the gall of it? These pirates are tough guys, they kill, they attack warships, and here's this young officer alone, telling them off like little kids. Anyway, they send word to get the 50-talent ransom. Caesar, he basically treats the pirates with a bit of contempt, treating them more like his servants than his captors. But he joins in with their exercises. He writes poems which he recites to them and expects them to listen to. Just over a month later, the silver arrives, and he's set free on the beach. But remember, he had made them a promise. Far from Rome, he can't call upon the legions to help him, so he sets about recruiting, building, and training his own army from the local fishing villages. Who does this kind of thing? Caesar, 25 years old, with his own personally trained army, takes to the seas and captures the pirates. And true to his word, he has them crucified. Although in a rare act of mercy, he has their throats slit while they're on the crosses. Has there ever been a person with more self-belief and conviction than Julius Caesar? The second character and second event I want to talk about involves Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican who had become emperor. Nowadays he's portrayed or regarded as a bit of a joke, an angry upstart of a man, furious and arrogant in all things. But few people know exactly how he got to power in the first place. There is one event that shows the true nature of the man, and I think it fits in with the idea of bravery and boldness, more so than any of his other victories later in life. And most importantly, it demonstrates the absolute belief he had in himself. This event was what marked the end of the French Revolution, and truly set Bonaparte upon the path to emperor. But at the time, he was not doing well. He was a decommissioned officer, he was on half pay, wondering why all of his plans to achieve status had come to naught. And then, the royalists attacked. Estimated at 30,000 men, this was an invading force, and they had made it to the capital, Paris. General Baron de Meneau was given the command of the Republican forces, but his 5,000 patriots were no match for the horde. He was dismissed. And then Paul Barras, or Vicomte de Barras, was given the command to try and repel the bloodthirsty royalists, and along with him came young Bonaparte. He had been ignored, dismissed and abused, but now he was needed. And let me tell you about this self-belief that he had. He said to the leaders, when they offered him second in command under Barras, quote, "I accept, but I warn you that, the sword, once out of its sheath, I shall not replace it until I have re-established order." End quote. And then he told them that he must have free rein. Now Barras was no commander, he was a politician, and only too happy to let the unknown Corsican take responsibility. And the rest of them, well, they were terrified. Napoleon, he sent for his cannons, and he set them out, and began a battle that would change the world. He warned, he threatened, and then acted. He fired, he commanded, he was on the front line, and all around him, others are dying, even the very horse he is sitting on. But he doesn't flinch. 5 hours. His cannons are reduced to firing pieces of scrap metal and cutlery. And then, when the enemy was wavering, he launched his final attack. This should have been suicide. He should have been butchered, shot to pieces, torn to pieces by the royalists. But he wasn't. And here's the thing. From the very start, when the cowed leaders of the Directory asked him to save them in their new republic, from that moment, Bonaparte knew that he would win, and he risked everything to prove that. The last event I want to tell you about is also the saddest. It involves Cesare Borgia, who, despite being the least famous of the men I've talked about so far, was, in my opinion, the most complex and interesting. Cesare was the illegitimate son of Rodrigo de Borgia, or Pope Alexander VI, as he became. Now, back in the 1450s, 1460s, it wasn't uncommon for men of the church to have families. They were rarely acknowledged as such, but it wouldn't stop you becoming pope. Now, Cesare, he was a second son, which meant that he was destined for the church. And true to the Borgia Pope's power and influence, this meant he was to be a cardinal. Cesare didn't want this. He was, through and through, a warrior, a real fighter. And when opportunity arose, with the death of his own brother, he became the very first person to resign from the College of Cardinals. He became the commander of the papal armies and set about uniting the various states of Italy. And what a commander he was. The citizens in the towns and city-states that he claimed, they became loyal to him. He was brash, bold, very smart. In fact, Niccolo Machiavelli, in his most famous work, The Prince, he wrote about Cesare Borgia. He saw him as, quote, the perfect example for other princes to follow. But his heady days, they weren't to last. After the death of his father, the Pope, things went from bad to worse. He was betrayed, imprisoned, pursued, until 1507, when, hunted by all, he became the commander of his brother-in-law's army, the King of Navarre, Jean d'Albret. Now, this final story has been told in many ways, but the theme remains the same. He was in command of an army, but when it came to the crucial point in the battle, during the main charge, he realized that he was alone in charging the enemy. It seems that his captains had either been bribed or threatened to abandon him. Cesare Borgia, who once said it was better to die in the saddle than in a bed, he rode on, alone, attacking the enemy, until he fell. He was just 31 years old. On his tomb there's a short epitaph. It goes, "Here lies in a little earth he who everyone feared, he who peace and war held in his hand. O you who go in search of worthy things to praise, if you could praise the worthiest, then your path stops here, and you do not need to go any further." It's fitting, I think, for his bravery and his belief are still talked about today. These were all real people who did what we think is impossible. Their level of self-belief is like nothing that we can even imagine people having today. And just look at what they achieved. But what of fiction and folklore? One of the greatest examples, in my opinion, of self-belief and determination is found in a poem that really does rate as one of the most important works in the English language, Beowulf. The story is thought to be around 1,000 years old, the written form anyway. Some suggest even 1,300 years old, and it's a great tale. What most people miss in this story, though, is that it's about belief. It's based around the 6th or 7th century in England, when Christianity became the dominant religion. And there was very much an element both in society and in the poem that God decides all things, and that we must meet our fate head on and without fear. Beowulf, our hero, he believes this too. He's a strong young man, always looking to test his strength and abilities, believing that God has given him his strength and his purpose. When he hears that the king of the Danes is being terrorized by an evil monster called Grendel, who keeps invading his hall and eating his men, Beowulf goes to help. The action starts pretty much straight away. Grendel turns up, and Beowulf, who has been pretending to sleep, he jumps on him, and they fight and they fight. And then, eventually, the other men try to hack Grendel apart, but their swords do nothing to him. They can't pierce his skin. What does Beowulf do? Does he decide to run and save himself from a monster that can't be killed by a sword? No. He continues and ends up tearing off Grendel's arm. Grendel runs away and dies. Then comes Grendel's mother, and she's angry and more than a little dangerous. After she kills some of the king's men, Beowulf chases her down and is offered an apparently magical sword that will kill her. And he tries to use it, but she just won't die. Is this because Beowulf has moved his belief from himself to a magical sword? It's possible this is what the story means. Anyway, he takes a regular sword and gets back to the killing work, and she falls. The third and final part of the poem comes when our hero is an old man, and now a king himself. He hears of a dragon, and instead of sending his younger, stronger warriors, he has the faith and the belief still that he's always had, and sets off to kill the dragon, knowing full well that he'll likely die. He says, quote, "When he comes for me, I mean to stand, not run from his shooting flames. Stand till fate decides which of us wins." End quote. He fights the dragon, and with help he wins, but he's mortally wounded. And this is what he expected. He expected no more from himself than to be the man who would stand and fight. Whether he lived or died was never his concern. That was the business of fate alone. His belief was that he would always stand true, no matter what, even if it means his death. Is it too much to expect our elected leaders to even have a scintilla of this integrity? To ask them to stand on principle alone? Sadly, this would require two things that they seem to forever be lacking: integrity and bravery. The two things that come from the belief that what you're doing is actually right and just. They know that what they support and advocate for is neither of these things. These petty tyrants living off borrowed power, who would sell out their own family for a single percentage point in favourability. How can they compare to real people of belief? They believe in nothing, and therefore they stand for nothing. And we would be better off without them. I'm Mark Angelides on The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a production of Liberty Nation. Check out libertynation.com for more podcasts, radios, TV and articles. And tune in next episode. We'll be looking about how historically, it's not always the person who wins that shapes the future. We'll be looking at political loss, what chances the Trump presidency has, the myths surrounding Spartacus, And we'll look at one of the most moving poems ever written, and it's based on real events, The Charge of the Light Brigade. And more importantly, how does all this tie together, and what does it mean for you today?